What's up, everybody? This is John from Coding Addict, and welcome to Redux tutorial video. Unlike React hooks, Redux is not part of official React library. Of course, since it's used so often in React projects, one might think that it's part of React, but in fact, it's not. In short, Redux is an app-level state management library. I know. Sounds extremely complicated, but keep in mind that we're already familiar with app-level state. Remember Context API? Well, in a lot of ways, Redux is very similar to Context API, just a bit more rigid and opinionated. In fact, if you're comfortable with use a reducer hook, I can guarantee you'll grasp the main concepts of Redux in no time. The main idea of Redux is exactly the same as for the Context API, setting up the state in the app level. So multiple components have access to the state, and as a result, we can avoid prop drilling or passing down the props to the components that actually don't need them. We purposely cover Redux at the very end of the course. For one, despite common misconception, you don't need to use Redux in all your React projects. With arrival of Context API, React hooks, and user reducer in particular, only very big projects might require Redux. So please don't start converting all your projects to Redux, despite what the Twitter gurus might tell you. And the second reason why we cover Redux at the very end is because even though Redux is not hard and the actual API is quite small, it is my strong belief that you'll understand it way faster and better once you have a solid understanding of main React concepts. Since there's not much theory to cover about Redux, we will directly proceed to build a project using Redux. And I purposely picked one of the projects we already completed previously, since that way we can focus on Redux implementation only and avoid wasting our time on irrelevant details. In order to follow along with the project, you will need a starter, and it's located in this GitHub repo. So look for my GitHub profile, John Smilga, and more specifically, search for starter project Redux tutorial cart. Again, the repo name is starter project Redux tutorial cart. And once you get here, just pick one of the available options. So pick between clone and download. And once you do that, you're good to go. I think I'm going to go with clone option. So let me select copy, then back on my desktop. I'm going to zoom in just so I can see that I'm not doing any sorcery. So cd, desktop, then of course we would want to run git clone. We'll get our project, and then I'm right away going to open up my text editor, drag and drop my folder. Now, of course, you can rename it if you'd want. Since I have the name as a starter project Redux tutorial cart, that is probably annoying to some people. So I'm just going to go with Redux cart and then drag and drop my folder. Then I would want to open up the browser window just so I can see the code side by side. So essentially the project that I'm working on side by side. And then of course, text editor on the other one. So let me set them up. For some reason, I keep on messing this up. Okay. Let me set them up side by side. Now you'll need to run npm install. So in this case, I'm opening up the integrated terminal, and the command for that is control and backticks. So I'm going to go with npm install, and I'm right away going to run npm start. So that will spin up the dev server, and you'll right away see how our starting project will look like. Now, I do want to mention that I right away installed all the dependencies as well. And more specifically, we're talking about two dependencies. So we'll have a Redux that is responsible for storing our data and then giving us a methods to update our data. And then we'll have React Redux that will allow us to connect our Redux store to our React application, because you need to understand that Redux can be used not only with React, you can use with whichever front-end library you would want. For example, Angular or Vue. Redux is just on its own responsible for storing the data and then giving us methods to update that data. In order to connect Redux to our React application, we will need React Redux. But of course, once we get to that point, I'll talk about it in great detail. Just keep in mind that both dependencies have been installed. Now, once my starter project is ready to go, I can close my integrated terminal. And then, like I said, essentially we have the whole application apart from the functionality. Now, let me also open this up in the bigger browser window, just because there's going to be some times where I would want to show you how it looks like on a bigger screen. So we have the nav bar, we have our icon with the amount of items we have in a cart. For the time being, it's hard coded as 0. Then, of course, some kind of title, and then 3 items with title, price, remove option. Again, nothing is happening as you're clicking, neither anything is happening as you're clicking on increase or decrease, and then some kind of image for the item. All the way in the bottom, we have clear cart. Again, you can press all day long, nothing will happen, and then we will have our total. As far as the file and folder structure, it's as straightforward as it gets. So I have the list, and I'm just rendering the list since there's no functionality. Now, my list is located in the cart items. It is represented with the array, and then each item is represented as an object. And for the object, we have properties and then values. For example, ID, title, price, image, as well as the amount, which initially is set to 1. Then in app.js, I get those items, and I also get 2 components. I get the navbar, that is just a dump component that displays currently the title and my cart icon. And then I have the cart container. And then in the cart container, as a prop, I pass in my cart items. And the prop name is cart. Again, normally you would set up some kind of state value. But in our case, since we'll use Redux later anyway, I just went the easy way and passed it down as a prop. So it's not here even as a state value. And then in the cart container, and you can find the 3 components in the components folder, you can see that cart container will receive my cart prop. Now, I did set up some default parameters just in case, I don't know, the cart is not array. Since I have the dependency here, the if statement, since I'm checking for the length, that's why I added here the default parameters where if everything goes bananas, at least it will be an empty array. And then we have a if statement. So if the array will be empty, essentially cart length is equal to 0, then we'll display your bag is currently empty. If not, then we're iterating over my cart prop, my array, and then for each and every item, I'm returning the cart item. So that's what you see right here. And of course, up on the top, we're importing that cart item, and then we pass all the properties that we had in the object down to a item. And then in the cart item, again, we get those properties as props, image, title, price, and amount. And then one by one, we're just displaying. Of course, we have the buttons that currently do not have any kind of functionality, but essentially it is just a list that we're displaying. Now, feel free to pause the video and get familiar with an application, but now I will switch gears and we'll spend a few minutes talking about Redux in Slideville. So what in the world is Redux? And in short, Redux is an app-level state management library. So think of React Context API we have used in our previous projects, but a bit more rigid and opinionated. So effectively, introducing Redux to your app will give it more structure and rules, which is beneficial as your app grows bigger, especially if you have more than one person working on the app. The main idea of Redux, though, is exactly the same as the React Context API, setting up the state in the app level. So multiple components have access to the state and methods without the prop drilling. So essentially, any component in our application can access the state in methods without passing it through the parent component. Now, let me also address some common misconceptions about Redux. Just because Redux is so often paired with React does not mean that Redux is part of React. You see, Redux is responsible for storing our data and providing methods to update that data. And in fact, you can use just as easily Redux with any other popular front-end library, like, for example, Vue or Angular. Now, that leads me to a second misconception. You do not need to use Redux in all your projects. In fact, in most cases, it's probably an overkill. Now, I'm not saying you should not learn Redux, especially since it is a requirement for many front-end jobs, but just keep in mind that with an arrival of React hooks, especially use reducer hook, for smaller applications, there are some strong alternatives out there. When it comes to Redux, essentially we need to remember and understand only a few following building blocks. In Redux, store is a single piece of truth, and you can think of it as a global state in your React app. In fact, terms store and state are used interchangeably when covering Redux. When we think of it, it's nothing new to us. In a previous project, we used Context API in a very similar way. The major difference between Redux and Context API is the way we can update our state. You see, when it comes to Redux, we cannot update store directly. That is not allowed. The way we update our store in Redux is by dispatching an action. And you can think of actions as what we would want to do. For example, you want to add a product to the cart. You will dispatch an add to cart action. You want to open up the modal, you'll dispatch open modal action. And hopefully you get the gist. Once you dispatch the action, you can handle it in Reducer. And Reducer is nothing more than a function that takes two arguments, state and action. When it comes to state argument, you can think of it as an old state or state before action was dispatched. An action argument provides the info of what type of action was dispatched. The key about Reducer is that it does not mutate state directly. In fact, you always should return a new state from Reducer. In Reducer, we're going to handle what action is dispatched and update our new state appropriately. Once we return a state from Reducer, that becomes our new state and we can start all over. To give you an example, imagine we have a shopping cart and we would want to add an item to the cart. So our shopping cart is going to be our store. That could be an object, that could be an array, it doesn't really matter. So we're going to access our store and we're going to display in our application what items are already in a cart. Now, the thing is, if I would want to add an item to the cart, I'm not just going to click on a button and directly access the store and then update the store and, of course, display all the items that have been added to the cart. That is not allowed. In fact, once we click on Add to Cart button, then we're going to dispatch an action. We can name our actions however we would want, but most likely adding to the cart is going to be Add to Cart action. And then once we dispatch our Add to Cart action, then we're going to handle it in Reducer. And Reducer is going to take the old state, so the state before action was dispatched, and then it's just going to check, okay, what we would want to do when we're handling the Add to Cart action. And of course, since in our case, we would want to add item to the cart, we're going to copy the old state values, update the cart, make sure that we added the item, and then return our new state. So once we return our new state, that becomes our state. If we would want to do it all over again, we can definitely do it. If we would want to, let's say, dispatch a different action, remove item to the cart, we're going to do the same thing, only in this time, we're dispatching remove item from the cart. And then, of course, in Reducer, we're also handling it a bit differently. However, it doesn't change the main idea, where we cannot update the store directly from the UI. We need to dispatch an action, then that needs to go through Reducer, and only the state that is returned from Reducer is our new state. Awesome. Once we're familiar with our setup, let's roll up our sleeves and finally write some code. And I guess we'll start by setting up our store. And in Redux land, store is used to hold our data. Now, you can also think of store as a single source of truth and a way for us to manage the state of our application. And in order to get up and running with the store, you'll need following three things. Create store function from the Redux, a variable which will hold the value, and then Reducer function. And I guess I'm going to start by peeling off the create store function from the Redux. So let's write import. Then it is a named import. So I need to use the curly braces, create store from, you guessed it, Redux. And then once we have imported the function, now we would want to set up the variable that will hold the value. And again, think of store as a place where we'll store our data. Now I'm going to name mine store, but as always, you can call it Bugs Bunny. It doesn't really matter. It's just a variable name, but I'm going to go with store is equal create store. Let's invoke it. And if I save it without passing the Reducer, you'll see that our application will blow up. Now, the reason why our application blows up is because create store is looking for the argument. And the argument it's looking for is the Reducer function. And you can think of Reducer function as a way for us to update our store. Now, just to emphasize that Reducer is a plain old JavaScript function, as an argument, I'm just going to pass here empty arrow function. I can save it, and as you can see now, my application works as expected. Now we could technically set up all our functionality right here. The problem with that approach is that the reducers normally hold quite a bit of code since all the store functionality is right there. So a more sane approach would be setting up a separate function and then just reference that function. And as a side note, as our application will grow, we will move reducer to its own file altogether. So in my case, I'm going to create here comments. I'm going to write a reducer. Then, of course, you can write it as an arrow function, but I'm just going to pick a good old regular JavaScript function. Then as far as the name, I don't know, I'm going to go with a reducer, no parameters for the time being. And then in the function body, I'm going to write console log. If you are very conservative, you can go with hello world or hello Redux. But since I feel like a rebel today, I'm going to go with shake and bake. Now, of course, I do need to reference the function. Otherwise, this does not make sense. So let me reference the function. And then I can see that my application didn't blow up. Awesome. And then also in the console, I have shake and bake, which means that my reducer is ready to work. Beautiful. Once we have set up our store and reducer, now we can zero in on the specifics of the reducer. And when it comes to reducer, again, like I previously already mentioned, reducer function is used to update our store, and it takes two arguments, state and action. And you can think of state as an old state or state before the update, and action of what happened in your application or what kind of update you would want to make to your store. Now, easy way of thinking of actions is thinking what is the user doing. So for example, we have the cart. So what if user would like to click on the increase button? Well, we would set up the functionality where if that happens, then of course we increase the amount of items we have in the cart. We also set up the total and all that. So the same would work if we would decrease, if we would remove, and along those lines. Now, of course, since they're arguments, you can technically name them however you'd like, but a common practice is naming them state and action. Now, once we pass in our parameters, then I would like to console log them just so we can see what is happening. So I'm going to go with object in this case because I think it's going to be more representative, and I'm going to go with state and action. So once we console log both of them, we notice something really interesting. So as far as state, at the moment it is undefined. And then I'm not going to cover the action right now. This would be just a default action that is passed in to initialize everything from the Redux. So later we're going to create our own actions, but at this point in time, Redux just passes a default action which initializes everything. So we have our state, we have our action, but of course now we need to deal with the fact that our state at the moment is undefined. So what's up with that? Well, you see, when we have the create store, we can pass in the second argument, and that would be our initial store. Of course, we would still need to set it up. So for example, above the reducer, I can say initial store, and then I'm going to create it as a variable, of course, const initial store, and for the time being, that will be equal to an object. And then within the object, I'm going to have the count property, and the count will be equal to 0. Now, like I said, the second argument in the create store is where we pass in our initial store. So I'm going to go with initial store. And now in the console, we should still see our default action. That would be that funny action with the type. And then state now is count. So in the beginning, it was undefined because we didn't pass any kind of initial value. But then, of course, once we set up our initial store, now this is our initial state of the application. And then when it comes to our reducer, we have one of the two options. Either we're going to return updated state, so state after the action happened. For example, again, user decided to remove the item. So we're going to have functionality that checks for that action. If that action happened, then of course we're going to do our calculations, remove that product from the state, and then return a new state without that product. But always, as a default, you should return the old state. So state before the update. So if, for example, some kind of action happened and you are not checking for that action, you should always return the state before the update. That's why in the bottom, I'm going to write return state. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm saying, all right, I'm going to be checking for the actions. If none of the actions match to whatever action just happened in my application, then I'm just going to return the state the way it was before the update. When we create a store in Redux, we have access to GetState function. And does anyone wants to make a wild guess of what this function is doing? And I can give you a hint. The name describes everything that the function is performing. So you can probably already guess. Essentially, with GetState, effectively, we're just going to get back our state. What is our initial state right now? It is property count and the value of 0. As it's going to be changing, of course, then we're going to be returning the latest state. Now, I also want to showcase that that is true. Otherwise, you might be thinking that there's some sorcery involved. So right below the store, I'm going to console log my store get state, and let's invoke the function. So now I have two things in a console. I have the state in action coming from the reducer, and then of course I have my initial state. And then just to showcase that we could pass this to our React components, we're just going to try it out with a navbar. Keep in mind, of course, when we're going to be setting up our application, we will use the special library for that to connect our Redux store to our application, and the library name is React Redux. But since we're just testing things out, I would still want to pass it down to a navbar. So where I have the navbar, I'm going to create a cart prop. And I'm going to set that cart prop equal to store get state function. So we pass it down as a prop. Okay, good. Now, of course, we need to look for our navbar component. And then since I passed it down, now, of course, I can access it. Remember, the name was cart. Now we have a few options. Either I can access it directly because I know that it is an object, or just to be more clear, I'm going to destructure it. So I'm going to go with const. Then I'm looking for the count that is coming from my cart prop. So if I'm going to change the 0 that is hard-coded to my count prop, I should, again, still have 0. But now in this case, we're going to have an option of changing our initial state. And that should show here all the way up on the top on the right-hand side. So I'm going to head back to app.js. And then remember our initial store. If we set up everything correctly, then now we should have 78, which we do, because our initial state is 78. And then, of course, since we passed it down to the navbar, that's why it's represented right here. While passing dummy values around our application is a lot of fun, you're probably more interested of how you can set up your own action. Because, of course, that is the way for us to control our store. And the way we do that in Redux is by using dispatch method, which effectively sends the actions to the store. Now, if you're interested in what kind of syntax we have for the actions, you don't need to look any further than your first console log, where you can see the action, and then we have the object, and we must have a type property with a string value. Now, as far as the value, it's really up to you. So, for example, in our application, that would be increase, decrease, remove, and clear the cart. But of course, for the different application, you'd have different actions. And then once you send it up, then you're going to set up the functionality where you're going to be checking for that action. And then you're going to work on your state. Now, one thing you need to keep in mind that you cannot mutate the old state, because Redux is built on immutability. So you need to make a copy and then return that copy from the reducer. So how it's going to look like? Well, I have my console log for the get state. I think I'm going to keep that for now. And then right above that, remember the method name was dispatch. So we go with dispatch, and then we need to pass our action. Again, let's remember, actions needed to be what? They needed to be an object. And then in the object, we must have a type property. And as far as the value, I think I'm going to start with decrease. And a common practice is typing them all uppercase. Of course, you can be a rebel and do whatever you'd want, but if you're going to be looking at someone else's code, in most cases, you're going to see the string value in uppercase. So in my case, I'm going to type decrease. Let's save that. And now I notice something really interesting in my console where I have two console logs, even though technically I didn't do anything specifically here in a reducer. And what I see here is that, yes, I have my initial one. I have still the state with count of 78, and I still have my default action that just initializes everything. But then right after that, I have still the state, but action has changed. So now my action is with a type of decrease. And now, of course, the functionality is following, where instead of just console logging, we're going to set up if statements, where I'm going to say if action dot type, because I'm looking for the type property, is equal. And then, of course, I need to have exactly the same value. Otherwise, it's not going to make sense. And since I like to make a lot of dumb typos, just to be on the safe side, I'm sorry, see exactly what I was talking about. I cut it out. I should have just copy and paste. I'm going to copy and paste because chances of me creating a typo are really, really big. So I have action type. What would I want to do? Well, for the time being, let's just console log and let's say, hey, it actually worked. And let's see what we're going to have in a console. So I have first console log, second one, and I have, hey, it actually worked. Awesome. So I know that now I'm checking for my action. So the action of decreasing the amount. So of course, now I can set up the functionality. I have my count. It is in a state. So now we can decrease the value. And our initial thought would be following. Okay, I have the state. So I can just say stay count is equal to state count -1. Correct? Now, the problem with that is that we're mutating our state. And that's not something we would want to do in Redux because Redux is built on immutability. So effectively, we cannot do this. We have to make a copy. How do we make a copy? Well, simply, we just say return. Then we're going to go with new object since we only have one property in there anyway. And I'm going to set my count property equal to state count -1. And notice what we're doing. So now we're returning a new object. So that way we're not mutating the old state. So now I save it. I still have my result of 77, but now I'm doing this the proper way where I'm returning a new value. And just to showcase that it is working, let me just copy and paste, for example, 5 times. And if my initial value was 78, I should see here 73. I can save it. And there you go. We have the 73 and successfully we have dispatched our first action. Once we have successfully dispatched our first action, I want to talk about why we would want to return the old state at the very least, and what happens if our actions do not match. So for example, I would dispatch some kind of action that I'm not checking in the reducer. And I guess let's start by our return. So technically, we could return anything we would want from the reducer. Now, the problem is that, of course, our functionality will break. And there's no better way how to check that out by just changing our state value. So I'm going to go with shake and bake. That's the string I'm returning. And now, of course, I have not a number. Why do I have not a number? Because the first time I pass in my initial state, awesome, but then I'm returning my string. So, of course, since I switched from initial store to my string, now all the functionality goes bananas, even though my actions technically match, correct? I dispatch decrease and I'm checking for decrease. But how can I increase the count on a string of shake and bake? That's the reason why, at the very least, you should always return the old state, because that's just going to ensure that your functionality will work. That's the first case. Then the second thing that I would want to cover, what happens if our actions do not match? I mean, if we dispatch some kind of action that is not checked in my reducer. And the simple answer is nothing. Nothing happens. Now we can see that if I, for example, copy and paste, I'm just going to change it to an action that we will have in later videos, and that is increase. So as you can see, at the moment, we're not checking for the increase. So if I save, even though the action is dispatched. Notice my last action will be increased. Since I'm not checking in my reducer, nothing happens. So my action flows through the reducer if I don't have a matching if statement where I'm actually checking for that specific action, nothing. I just return my old state, which at the very end is 73. That's why when we have GetState, of course, our value is also 73. Beautiful. We covered the reasoning behind our setup. So now let's dispatch two more actions. One for increase and the other one for reset. I don't think I need that many decreases. So one by one, I'm just going to delete them. I'm going to have one decrease and then let's say a few increases. So let's copy and paste that one. And then at the very end, we're going to have a reset. So let me copy and paste one more time. Let me set up all caps. And then instead of increase, we're going to go with reset. Now I'm going to start with 0 because I think that's just going to be a better setup. So instead of 78, my initial store will have a value for the count of 0. And now, of course, I have -1. Why do I have -1? Because I do have the action dispatched by the value of decrease. I'm checking that in my reducer. And then, of course, I just subtract 1. Of course, I have 3 more actions, and I would need to take care of them in my reducer. Since I would want to speed this up, we're just going to copy and paste 1, 2, and we just need to change these values around. So instead of decrease, of course, we're looking for increase. And yes, I will copy and paste because that will ensure that there are no typos. We have increase, and then also I'm going to do the same thing for the reset. Copy and then paste. So now I have 3 things. I have decrease, increase, and reset. And you can probably already guess that in this case, we're going to have +1. And then here, we're just going to set it equal to 0. Now, by mistake, of course, I copy and pasted the wrong way of setting up the state. So let me delete that. And probably it shouldn't be there anyway, since that's not the way how we can actually work with the Redux. So let me save it. And now, of course, I have -4. Why? Well, because I should have fixed here the +1 for the increase. Then reset will be equal to 0. So instead of using the count, I don't really need it in this case, since again, I would just want to set it to 0. So now returning the count with a value of 0. And once I save, I have 0. Why? Well, because I decreased the first time, then I have 2 increases, and then I reset it. So as we're going to be changing these values around, then you'll see that now we're going to have +2. Again, we decrease, so -1, then we reset back to 0, and then we have increase, +1, and +1. So those would be the basics of working with Redux. Again, we have the store, we have the reducer, and then we have the actions, which we dispatch using dispatch method. And then in the reducer, we just check for those actions for the action type more properly. And then based on the action type, we set up the functionality, what we would want to return from a reducer. Now, if there is an action dispatch that does not match any of our if statements, well, we're just going to return a old state. And to showcase that, I'm just going to copy and paste. And then instead of having some kind of action that I'm checking in a reducer, why don't we just say random? So of course, I know I'm not checking for that action, but it still doesn't affect my result. So even though I'm not checking, I'm still returning the old state, which is awesome. And then if I have the action that does have the matching if statement, then of course we're performing the functionality. At the moment, our initial store is super nice and cute. I mean, one property with a number value. Come on, what could be better than that? In reality, though, chances are your application state will be more complicated than that. So what to do if we have more properties? First of all, I guess let's take a look at the problem that we're going to have if we're going to add more properties, but still keep our functionality exactly the way it is. So I'm going to go with name property. Again, very, very original. And I'm going to go with John. So I save it. Okay. At the moment, nothing is happening, but I can see down here where I have GetState that for some reason John is missing. So why is the John missing? Well, let's do a little bit of investigation. So I have my first one. That is, of course, my console log that is coming from reducer. And I can see that I'm getting the whole object. I have count 0 and then name is equal to the John. But once I return after the first action that matched, which in my case is going to be decrease, you'll see that John is going to go bananas. So let me check the first one. That is, of course, where I'm still getting the old state. So that doesn't count. This is the first time where I'm having decrease. But after I'm done with my first decrease, of course, count is -1 and John is simply missing. So why is John missing? Well, let's think about it. We have the object. I'm returning the property with a count, and then I'm just checking for my state. So where's John here? Well, John is nowhere to be found. That's why we don't have it in our result. And what would be the solution? Well, prior to ES6, we could use the object.assign. So essentially what we would want to do is copy the properties from the old object, and then only the ones that we would want to change, those ones we would set the new value for, but the ones that we would want to keep the same, well, we wouldn't touch them. Now, like I said, prior to ES6, we would use object.assign. However, with the arrival of ES6, we have a easier way, and that is object spread operator. So let me delete it. And then the way object spread operator works is we're still going to return a new object. So that still stays the same. But then if we type ... and then state, what effectively we're doing, we're copying, pasting all the values from my old state. Now I'm not mutating. I'm just copying, pasting the values. So now I have access to all the old state values. Now the thing is, if I type here which property I would want to change, for example, I know I have the count, correct? And if I would want to affect the count, I just need to type count property. And now I'm going to override that and set it to a new value. So what is going to be my new value? Well, I'm going to set my count to be equal to state.count -1. So that still stays exactly the same. The difference here in this case, since I have multiple properties, now instead of just creating a new property and then using the old value, now I'm actually copy and pasting the properties from the old state as well. And what I'm talking about, the other properties, the ones that I'm not changing. So now in this case, let me change this around for all of them. So like I said, I just need to add here ... the object spread operator. So ... and then old state. So just spread out all the state properties that are coming from the old state, and then return the count one changed. And then of course I would want to do the same one for a reset as well, because I'm still looking for that John. So let me go ... then state, comma, and now I'm overriding the count. Let me save it. And now at the very bottom, I still have my John. So this would be the syntax if our initial store or initial state has more values. And just to hit this home, we're going to create one for the name, just so we can see what happens if we're changing the value for the name. Now, instead of random, I'm going to go with change name. Now, again, I'm going to copy and paste like so. And somewhere here, I'm going to check for that action type. So maybe right after reset, I'm going to say if action.type is equal to change name, well, then I would want to change it to Bob. How do we do that? Again, we return a new object. I'm going to spread out the properties from the old state. So essentially, I'm going to copy and paste them. And then instead of changing the count, I'm going to change name to Bob, or maybe Bobo. That's also fine. So now in the bottom, the count is 2 and the name is Bobo, or whatever you place it over here. So again, if we have multiple properties in our state, then we cannot just simply return a new object with just one property that we would want to change. Effectively, we need to make sure that we get all the properties and then only the ones that we would want to overwrite or give it a new value, Those are the ones that we're adding here. Now, of course, we're not limited to just changing one property. For example, if I have decrease, I could also change my name here, since that is the second property. Keep in mind, if you're going to try to change some kind of property that is not on the object, of course, that will not make sense. But since I know that I have two properties, I have the count and I have the name. For example, here I'm going to write Anna. Now, again, if I'm going to check the third console log, of course, that is after my first decrease, I'm going to see that name is right now Anna. So the count is -1, but then I set up my name to be Anna. While working with actions, a better way how we can set them up is by saving them in a variable and then using the variable instead. And why would we want to do that? Well, notice, of course, we are dispatching our actions, but since they're string, it's very easy to make a typo. For example, if I'm going to copy and paste 2 more times, and if everything is correct, of course, my value should be 4. But what if I make a typo? For example, so I make a typo. Now, of course, the action does not match, and my value instead of 4 is 2. So what happens? I dispatch this action 2 times. However, in my reducer, none of the if statements match to whatever action I dispatched. And it's very hard to find it because we also don't get the error, correct? If we just have a string, we had a typo, and then we can spend all day looking for the bug, even though it's just as simple as missing 1 letter. And that's why a better setup is setting up actions as variables. How that would look like. Again, common practice is using the uppercase. So for example, we have what? 4 actions, correct? So in my case, I'm going to go with decrease. Let me go with uppercase in this case. So I'm going to go with decrease, and that will be equal to my string value of decrease as well. So let me just retype that. I have my decrease. And now instead of using the string everywhere where I set up that action type, instead, I'm going to use my decrease variable. So decrease in the reducer, and the same goes for my dispatch. Instead of string, I'm just going to keep it as a variable. And in this case, if I have the typo right away, I'm going to have a big fat error. For example, notice we have the error where it says, you know what, you haven't defined this variable. And of course, I haven't defined it because the name is decrease, not the one that I have here. So that's why it is much more better setup if we have our actions as variables, and in those variables, we hold the value for our string. And then since usually you have more than just one action, a common practice is setting up a separate file altogether. So where I have the source, I'm going to create a new file, and you guessed it, I'm going to call this actions.js. Now in the actions.js, I would want to set up my variables. Of course, I would want to export them. So in the app.js, and then later in the reducer file, I can import them. So one by one, we're going to go with export. And of course, it's going to be named import, not a default one, since there's going to be multiple actions. And now we're just going to name them. And I'm right away going to write my actions for the application we're going to build. So not for just testing out the Redux, but in fact, all the actions we're going to use later on. That's why some of them we're not going to be using, of course, in the reducer, but I would want to set them up right away. So I'm going to go with decrease, and that is going to be equal to my decrease string. Then let me copy and paste 5 times because I would want to have 6 values. Now I'm going to use Command D to delete all of them like so. And then one by one, let's set them up. So I'm going to use 2 cursors in this case. I'm going to go with increase. Then the next one is remove. So that is responsible for removing single item. That is going to be our action. After that, we're going to have action to clear the whole cart. So clear cart. After that, we're going to have get total and get amount. So get total. Now I do need to place here the underscore in between. And then also I'm going to have the same thing for get amount. Let me select it, get amount. We can save it. That works well. And now, of course, if we're exporting, we also need to import in our app.js. For the time being, we're not going to import all of them because again, we're just testing out. So I would just want to import decrease and increase. And in fact, I will remove the other two, the reset and change name, since again, this is just for practicing Redux. It's not going to be implemented in our application. So let me delete, of course, my two if statements. Then I also would want to only use decrease and increase like so. So change name and reset will go. Of course, we're going to change this to a variable, same how here, but we do need to import it first. So maybe right after create store, I'm going to close my sidebar. And then instead of all caps, I'm going to go with import. And then I'm importing decrease and then increase. I'm sorry, not increase, but increase like so, coming from the actions. And then, of course, I do need to reference the file. So from dot and then actions. And once we have imported, then of course, we're going to set this to a variable. Now I'm not going to use the local variable, even though again, technically you could set this up this way. But again, what happens with actions.js, it just frees up the space. So you're not clogging up your files that way, because in most cases, there's more than just one action. So I'm going to remove the decrease, my local variable, and instead of increase string, I'm going to set this up as increase variable. And the same thing, of course, I'm going to do here in the bottom where I'm dispatching the action. Instead of using straight up string, we're going to use a variable that holds that string value. And that way, of course, we can have less errors. Let me delete all these strings like so. And then I'm just going to reference my increase variable. The moment I save it, notice I have the value of 3. So the first one I decrease by 1, and then I increase 4 times. That's the reason why I have 3. And again, the reason why you would want to set up your actions as variables, because it is very easy to make a typo, especially if you're typing, I don't know, 20,000 times all throughout your application. But if you set it up as a variable, and if you have the wrong reference, you right away are going to get the error. And as always, there is a bug. As I'm typing, it should be simple remove instead of the gibberish that I had here before. And similarly to why we moved the actions out of the app.js, I also would want to remove the reducer, because there's going to be way more functionality to what we have right now, and you really don't want to clog up your app.js. So that way we have more space and it's more understandable of what is what. So the functionality will be in reducer file, and then we're just going to import the reducer and set it up once we set up the store. So again, sidebar open, then let's look for the source. And then in the source, let's create our reducer.js. Keep in mind, later, as we're adding more reducers, we're going to set this up in a separate folder altogether. But for the time being, we have reducer.js. So I'm going to head back to app.js. So let me make a proper selection, cut it out. I don't think I need anymore the comment. And then in the reducer, I'm just going to copy and paste. Now I do need to export it, and I think I'm just going to go with default export. So export default, and I do have my reducer. Let me save it. Now there's going to be a problem though, because notice how we're referencing right now our variables. We're referencing decrease and increase. So this is going to be the case where we're going to have to change it. So we're still dispatching in the app.js, and we're going to do that for maybe 2 videos. Once we set up, of course, our functionality in the application, that's not how we're going to dispatch our actions. But since at the moment we have our dispatches, and since I want to show you that our reducer will still work, even though it's going to be in a separate file, I'm going to keep my imports here, but we would want to also copy and paste it in the reducer.js as well. Otherwise, again, we're going to have a big fat error. And then where I have the app.js, now I would want to import my reducer as well. So let me close the sidebar. And then right after the actions, I'm going to go import. Now it is a default export, so I can call this wherever I want, but I'm going to go with a reducer and then from, and of course, we're looking for my reducer file. And then I don't need to change anything. I'm already referencing the function, And once we save it, since we don't get any errors, that means that we successfully moved our reducer function to a separate file. And you can clearly see how we freed up the space in the app.js. So now our functionality is going to be in a reducer.js. Our actions are going to be in the actions.js. And then in the app.js, we're just going to set up the store and initialize it using our initial store and the reducer. We're almost ready to connect our application to a Redux. And then, of course, once we do, then our functionality in the reducer is going to get way more complicated than that. Because, of course, then we're going to actually deal with our cart, whether that's increase, decrease, remove, or clear the cart. And in order to do that, I would want to do a bit more changes in the app.js. So I would want to start by changing my initial store. So this was all good while we were practicing with the Redux. But then, of course, for our app, the initial store or initial state will be different. So what is going to be our initial state? Well, we're going to have a cart property, and the value will be our hard-coded cart items. Again, just to recap, cart items was an array, and then each and every item was an object. And at the moment, what we're doing is we're just bypassing that and passing it directly in the cart container where we have a cart prop, and then we set it equal to cart items. But of course, what I would want to do is access the cart in my cart container using the Redux. So in my initial store, the cart property will be equal to my cart items. So that will stay the same. And then there's going to be two more properties. We're going to have a total property, and initially it will be set to 0, as well as the amount. So what is the initial amount of items in a cart, which also will be 0. I will save this. And then, of course, at the moment, I do have my not a number because my reducer is still counting on a count property that is no longer there. And that's why we will not dispatch anymore from the app.js. We also don't really care about the state in here. And then I also would want to clean up my navbar and my reducer. So in the reducer, for the time being, let's start from the scratch, and we're just going to return the state. And the last thing that I would want to fix is the navbar, where I'm not going to be passing props this way. Again, we will use a Redux to access our values directly. So let me delete the prop. Then also let me look for my navbar, and I'm not passing anymore the cart prop. That was just to test out the GetState function. The destructuring also needs to go, and I'm going to change it back to hard-coded value of 0. I won't need anymore the decrease and increase from the actions, since we're going to set it differently using the Redux. And once we have cleaned up our application, we are ready to connect our application to Redux to display our items and also access the properties and set up a more sophisticated functionality in our reducer. Once we understand the basics of Redux and have separated reducer and actions into separate files, I guess it's an awesome time to connect our app to a Redux store. However, this time we'll take a more serious approach and use a React Redux library for that, since passing GetState function as a prop was cute while we were getting our feet wet with Redux, but is not a particularly serious approach in the long run. And when we work with React Redux library, we're looking for two things. We're looking for the provider that will wrap our whole application. And then essentially, we are going to use the connect function in each of the components that would want to access that info. Now, the info that I'm talking about is the store. So, for example, in our case, that is cart, total, and amount. And also, of course, our dispatch method. And then we can pass in whatever actions we would want. And as a side note, if you have worked with Context API, the setup is very, very similar. So I'm going to start by importing the provider. Import, it is a named export. So we go with provider from React Redux. So once we have our provider, then I would want to wrap my application. And of course, I have multiple choices. So I could even technically go to index.js and wrap my app component as well. But since I'm already an app, it is a root component, I might as well just pass here to provider, and then each and every component will have access to my whole Redux store. Again, if you have worked with Context API, normally probably you would use index.js. You would just wrap your app component. But then since all the components are currently rendered in the app.js anyway, might as well do it right here. So instead of main, I'm going to delete this HTML element and I'm going to go with my provider component. Once I save it, there will be a big fat error. The reason for this error is that the provider component is looking for the prop, and the prop name is store. And you can probably already guess what kind of value we need to pass in the store prop. If you're guessing store, you are exactly correct. So store is equal to our store. So if you call this Bugs Bunny, just pass in the Bugs Bunny. Now, once I save it, there's no error. Everything works well. And now each and every component that is wrapped in the provider can access my store, can access the dispatch method and set up the actions, or essentially dispatch the actions to a Redux store once we set everything up using the connect function. Once we have wrapped our application using provider component, up next, we're going to use the connect function to get the values from the state and, of course, eventually also set up the dispatch method. So once the user clicks any of the buttons, well, something is happening. And I guess I'm going to start first by setting up the state values. And what I'm looking for here is in the navbar, I would want to show the amount. And my amount will be in the amount property. And at the moment it is 0. And since I would want to see that we are correctly connecting to our store, I'm just going to hard code this to 5. Of course, eventually we're going to have the functionality where this is going to be calculated dynamically. But at the moment, hard coding is good enough. Now let's navigate to navbar.js, and then we're looking for our connect function. And we need to import it as a named import. So let's go with connect from React Redux. And then connect has a bit of interesting syntax because it is a higher order component. Now, what that means is that it returns a component itself. So first of all, we write a connect. Then we have first set of parentheses. So that's the first function that the connect is returning. And then this function is looking for the component that is going to be connected to. So once we do this, now instead of just returning a navbar, we have access to our state and to our dispatch method since we wrapped our navbar in the connect. And then connect has few arguments, but the ones that are most commonly used are the first two: map state to props and then map dispatch to props. Please understand that those are arguments, so you can call this burrito and banana, but a convention is to call them map state to props and then map dispatch to props, and both of them are function. Now we're not going to use dispatch since there's no functionality in our navbar, so we're going to start with our first function. And I'm going to go with a common convention, so I'm not going to be a rebel, and I'm going to name mine map state to props. Of course, I do need to create that function here, so I go with const map state to props, and then in this function, what's really cool, as a parameter, I have access to my store. Now you want me to prove that? So if I'm going to type here state, which essentially is just my parameter, and if I'm going to go with console log, you'll see that in a console, we will see our store. Now, of course, at the moment, it's complaining that we need to return the object, and we'll do that in a second. But what is more important, that in my console, I can see that I have the cart. Awesome. I have the total, and I have the amount. And the way it works is, again, the actual naming already suggests all the functionality. So we have map state to props. So what do you think is going to happen right now? Effectively, we will map our store to a props of the navbar. Now, the cool thing is that we can pick which actual state values we will map. So we could technically map all of it, but we don't have to, since not every component needs to know everything that there is to know about the state of your application. And like our error message suggests,
we need to return a plain object from our map state to props. And then in that object, we set up the prop name. So in my case, I'm going to go with amount, and that is the prop that I will have access in the navbar. The same way if we would just pass it down for, let's say, the parent. And then, of course, I need to assign some kind of value. So in my case, since I know that I have access to all my store from the state, I can just say state, and then the property I'm looking for is the amount. Now I don't need to console log it, and of course I do need to return it. So I have my object, and I'm just gonna go with return, and then, like I said, we will have in the navbar amount prop that is equal to whatever I have in my state under the property of amount. I will save it, and then let's head on up. And where we have the navbar, of course, we have access right now to my amount property. So I'm going to access my property, and then just like normal React, I have access to my prop. And then instead of hard coding 0, I'm just going to go with amount. And there you go. We have a success, because right now in the navbar, I have access to a state, and more specifically, I have access to my amount value, and my amount value is 5, because of course now I hard coded. But as we're going to be changing our amount dynamically later on, it will also change here in the navbar. Again, the basic setup is following. We do need to import the connect. Connect is higher order component, so we need to run first set of parentheses, so we need to invoke it, and then we have second set of parentheses where we pass in the component. And essentially, we just export that component once we have run our connect. And then in the connect, we have few arguments, but the ones that we're going to use the most are the first one, map state to props, and the second one that we're going to cover in the few videos, map dispatch to props. And the way map state to props works is that we have a parameter, and that parameter has access to all our state. And then from the function, we do need to return a object. And then in the object, we're setting up our property values. So for example, what kind of property I'm going to have here, that will be my prop. So again, if I'm going to name this banana, of course, up in the navbar, I'm going to be accessing this time the banana prop, and then whatever value I'd want. And in this case, I'm just picking from the state, whichever value I would want. And of course, I set it equal to, and now I have access to my amount prop. And then in the component, I can just display whatever the value the amount prop has. Beautiful. Once we have connected our navbar to our Redux store using the connect method, I think we're ready to do exactly the same with our cart container. Because at the moment, the way we're displaying our items is because I have the cart prop on the cart container, and that is set equal to my cart items. So the array that is coming from cart items.js. But instead, I would want to connect my cart container to my Redux store, where I also have the cart items, of course. But then more importantly, I would also want to have access to a total, which at the moment, of course, is hard-coded as 0, and then a dispatch method, which will allow me to clear out my cart. So first, I would want to remove this prop. I don't want this anymore, since I don't want you to think that I'm cheating. So first, I'm going to delete it. And of course, as you can see right now, well, my bag is empty, since I'm not displaying my cart. Then I'm going to change my total, just so again, we have some kind of value that is different than 0, because that's just going to make it easier for us to see that we're accessing the correct value. I'm going to save my app.js. Then I'm going to open up my sidebar, then look for cart container, and the setup is going to be pretty much the same. Again, we need to look for connect. That is step number 1 from React Redux. Then down in the bottom, I'm looking for my cart container, and I would want to invoke my connect first, then wrap my cart container, and the same spiel. I have access to my map state to props function. So I'm going to go with map state to props. Just to make things interesting, I'm not going to go with arrow function. We're just going to go with good old function. just so you don't think that we always need to use the arrow functions. And then the same deal. We have our parameter, and I don't know, in this case, I'm going to call this store, just so you don't think that we always need to call this a state. And then same spiel, we do need to return our object. Or in this case, I'm looking for two things. I'm looking for my cart, which essentially will be my items. Since again, remember the functionality was following, where cart container will look for cart prop. Now, of course, I can rename my prop. It doesn't have to be cart, but it makes sense if I already have all the functionality for the cart. I just need to set up that prop equal to my cart items. So that's number one. And then the second one, I'm looking for my title. So those are the two things that I'm looking for the state. Now, if you want to one more time see the store value, then of course you can console log it. But in my case, since we already did that in navbar, I'm assuming that we already remember. And then what values I would want to return? Well, there's going to be two props. One will be cart prop, and the second one will be total prop. And what are going to be the values for my two props? Well, I have access to the store, and then in the store, cart value was equal to cart, correct? If we double check app, of course, that is my value, cart. And then total was exactly the same. So I can go here and I can say store and then total. Now, as a side note, of course, as you are using the ES6, we could have done it this way, where we just destructure both of these values. So I'm looking for the cart value, then I'm looking for the total from my store or state, however you would call your parameter here. And then in the ES6, we can just use the shortcut where I have the cart and I have the total. So you also could have written this way. So now we have both of these things, and check it out. Right away, all the functionality works again, because in the cart container, I'm looking for the cart prop. As long as you named your prop here exactly the same, the cart, everything will work. And then the second thing that I can look for is, of course, my total. And I'm still going to leave my default empty array value just because I'm checking for the cart length. And I would always want my cart to be at least a empty array. Otherwise, if it's not going to be empty array, well, there will be an error. So I'm going to go with cart. Then, of course, I have the default value. And then I'm also looking for the total prop. Now, as far as the cart value, we're iterating over our array. And then for each and every item, we're displaying our cart item where we pass in the values, the titles, the prices, the photo, and all that. And then, of course, I would want to do the same thing for my total. So I can see that I have my total text. And then instead of hard coding 0, 0, I'm going to go for my total prop. And then down at the bottom, I should have 105. Why do I have 105? Because that is the property in my store with a value of 105. And now successfully, we have connected not only the navbar, but also our cart container to our Redux store. Awesome. Once we have connected our components to a Redux store and we can display static data, let's switch gears, make things a bit more interesting, and start working on the functionality. So I'm going to start with clear cart just because my button is in the cart component anyway. So we might as well keep on working here. And I guess I said cart component. What I mean is cart container component, just to be more clear. And the second one, as far as reducer, the functionality will be very straight up, where instead of having a cart, we will switch to a empty array. So essentially, once the user clicks on clear cart, instead of setting it equal to cart items, we will set it equal to an empty array. Now we'll start by getting the action, the clear cart action, because that's the one we will use in reducer. And of course, once we dispatch the method, we need to use the same action. Let me copy and paste my variable. Then in the cart container, up on the top, I'm going to go with import, then copy and paste, just so I don't have any stupid bugs. And then from now, our components is the separate folder. So we need to go 2 levels up and look for actions in the source folder. Let me save it. And now the $1 million question. How can we have access to our dispatch method. And remember, I said that there is a second argument to our connect. So that would be one of the ways that we'll cover in the next videos when we start working with a single cart item. However, when we use map state to props, we also have access to a dispatch method. And since it is very cool, I want to show you first. So let me switch to a bigger screen and let's look for the Dev Tools, more specifically React Dev Tools. And you'll notice something interesting where we have the cart container. On the right-hand side, I can see the props. Okay. And then the props I have are cart, dispatch, and total. Now, cart and total makes sense, correct? Because in the cart container, we use map state to props and we mapped our store values to our props. More specifically, the props were cart and total. So those two make total sense. What about this guy though? What about that dispatch? I can see that I have the dispatch prop. By the way, you saw I didn't set them up myself. There is nowhere I wrote dispatch. So this was done by map state to props and it is equal to a dispatch function. Now, do you want to make a wild guess? What is this dispatch function doing? And if you guess that it is the same function stored in dispatch, you are exactly correct. So what's cool about map state to props, not only we can map our state values to our props, but also automatically we map our dispatch function to a dispatch prop. And what that simply means is that in the cart container, where I have the props, right after the total, I can write dispatch. And now I have access to my dispatch method. And where I would want to use that, well, I have my button, the clear cart button. And of course, we would want to set up on click. So on click, what should happen? Since we're going to invoke our function, the dispatch one, we need to make sure that we pass the arrow function because we would want to run clear cart once we click on a button, not right away. And then since we have access to our dispatch, I pass dispatch. And then remember, we needed to pass our action. So object with a property of type. And then let's use our clear cart. So clear cart variable, which holds the clear cart string. And we are good to go. Now, of course, we need to catch that in a reducer. So I'm going to move to a reducer. Again, I do need to import my clear cart. And then I'm going to set up my if statement. So if action type is equal to clear cart, what we would want to do? Well, I guess we need to start by returning a object, correct? A new object. Then we would want to copy all the values from the old state. So that's why we're using, again, the spread operator. We're copying the properties. And then we would want to override the cart one. And as far as the cart, I'm just going to go with cart. And then since I'm clearing the cart, the only thing we need to do is set it equal to an empty array. Let's save it. And then if everything has been set up correctly, once we press on clear cart, we should see is currently empty. So your bag is currently empty. Why is that happening? Well, because in my cart container, I'm checking if the cart array length is equal to 0, which of course is the case once we delete all our items, then I'm just displaying is currently empty. And of course, we can do it multiple times where once I refresh, again, I get my array with the items. But since I added my dispatch method, now each and every time my user will click on clear cart, the user will clear all the items from the cart. Before we start working with single cart items, I also would want to show you a alternative way how we can set up the reducer. Now, my preference is using if statements, but you can also use the switch statement. The reason why I'm showing you these multiple options is because it is a tutorial and you will see a lot in someone else's code where they use the switch statement instead. Again, it is a preference and I prefer using the if statements, but since I would want you to be aware how you can also use switch statements, that's why in this video, I will comment out the code that I currently have. Now, I'm not going to delete it because after this video, I'll switch back to it. But then just to showcase how we can do the same functionality using the switch statement, I'll write the same functionality using the switch statement. So in order to set up a switch statement, we need to go with switch keyword. Then we're checking for the action type. And then we place the curly braces. So in the curly braces, we're checking for the cases. So the same way how we're setting up the if statements, if action type is clear cart, if action type is decrease or increase and all that, we can set up cases here. So I go with case, and then of course I need to again use my variable. So I'm going to go if the case is clear cart, what would I want to do? So again, you would have case clear cart, case decrease, and along those lines. And then right after the colon, we're just going to type whatever functionality we would want. And in our case, what is the functionality we're looking for? Well, we would just want to, again, return the new object, copy the old state values, and then set cart equal to an empty array. And then as far as the switch, we also need to set up a default case. And in a switch, you just type default, and then you just write what would you want to happen by default. And in our case, what we would want by default is to return the state. So let me write a return state. Let's save it. And in order to test it out, let's try to clear the cart again. I press and I can see that all my functionality still works. The only difference is that I used switch statement for my setup. Again, I know I said this before, but it is a preference thing. I prefer using if statements. If you prefer using switch, feel free to use switch. At the end of the day, the functionality will work exactly the same. So like I said, I'm going to uncomment whatever I had before. And then just so I'd want to leave it for your reference, I'm going to comment out the switch statement. I'll move it somewhere down here. And then if you'd like to access the GitHub repo and actually take a look at the switch or use it, maybe you can always do that. It's going to be sitting here for your reference. Beautiful. Once we have used our first dispatch to clear the cart, up next we have remove, increase, and decrease. But since there's more moving parts as far as setting up this functionality, I would want to divide it in steps. And my first step will be getting the remove action into reducer, and then just set up some if statements with console log. So that way, as we're setting up our dispatches, we can say, okay, so if we have console log for removing the item, everything works correctly. We just need to set up the functionality in the reducer. So that way we will have a good reference whether we have connected at least everything correctly, and then we can just work on the functionality later. So I'm going to go with if action type, and then first let's start, I guess, with decrease. And then if decrease, again, we're just going to console log for the time being. So console log decreased, or you decreased amount. So let me copy and paste 1, 2. We'll change a second one. So let's go with increase. Now we also will change the console log text increased. And then I'm going to import my remove from actions, remove action, which will remove a single item. And then I'll change my action type also to remove. And of course, we can do the same thing for the text. So they would match, remove. Now, once we have prepared our reducer, now we can finally go to a cart item and take a look at the second option, how we can have access to our dispatch method. Awesome. With our basic functionality in place, I'm going to close the navbar cart container. I don't think I'm going to need that. And then I'm going to look for my cart item.js. So each and every item that I have in a cart. And then as far as the props, at the moment, we get props, of course, from the cart container, because we're passing in for each item the image, the title, price, and the amount. But there's no functionality. And again, we're going to have to use the connect method. We'll start by import, then connect, and it is coming from React Redux. Now, I also would want to right away import my 3 actions. So decrease, increase, and remove. So right before or after, doesn't really matter. We can go with import. We had increase, then a decrease, and then also we had a remove action. Of course, it is coming from, and then again, we need to go 2 levels up and look for the actions. So we have the connect and we have our actions. Now, well, remember in the bottom, we needed to export cart item, but we needed to wrap it in the connect function. So I'm going to go with my connect function. I will pass in my cart item, and then we have our 2 arguments. Now, in this case, do we need to have a first argument? Do we need a map state to props function? Well, we're already getting all the props that we needed from the cart container, correct? So that's all good. Now, what we need though is the dispatch. So in order to avoid getting the first function, we can just bypass it by passing in the null. So now we're just going to pass in the second argument. And the second argument is also a function. However, in this case, it maps the dispatch function to our props. So again, naming is up to you, but a common practice is naming this map dispatch to props. And similar way how we had map state to props as a function, we do the same thing for the dispatch. In this case, again, I'm going to switch to arrow function just because. And what happens as a prop, we are getting our dispatch. So same setup. Again, we're still setting up our object that we're returning that will be mapped to our props. However, in this function, the parameter is our dispatch method. Now, the difference in this case is the fact that we're not mapping our static state values to the props. In fact, I would want to set up my props as functions. And I'm going to start with the first one with remove, and then one by one, we will add the other ones later. So remove is equal. And now let me make a mistake. So first, I'm going to show you how we will fail if we will not set this up as a function. So I'm going to pass in my dispatch. And then remember, we needed to pass in the type. And then, of course, we still have our correct action, and that is remove. But then once I save it, and if we will open up the console, you'll see that I have 3 times you remove amount because I have 3 items. And then instead of running this, once the user clicks on a button, I invoke it right away because I have dispatch and invoke it. And that's the reason why when you're setting up your prop, you need to set it equal to a arrow function that returns this dispatch like so. So let me save it properly. And now in console, you don't see anymore the console log because now we will run it when the user clicks on a button. So that is my first prop, the remove prop that is equal to a result, the arrow function that returns a dispatch with a type of remove. And of course, now we need to head on up. And then right after the amount, I will look for my remove prop, which is a function. And then after that, we're looking for our button. And the same how we had for clear cart, we're going to have on click. But again, we do not want to invoke this right away. So curly braces, then first let's set up a arrow function. And now let's write remove and then in fact invoke it. Let's save that. And now each and every time I'm going to press on remove, you'll see in a console that the item is removed, or at least a console log that says that. Let's click. We have you remove amount, then you remove amount, and then you remove the amount. So that works. We're passing in our remove action. And I guess now we would want to start working on the actual functionality. Once the user clicks on the remove button, we are dispatching our remove action. So now we just need to take care of the functionality. Or let's think about it. So for remove functionality, wouldn't we need some kind of info of which item are we removing? If I ask you a question, most likely the answer is yes. Now let's take a look at the card items, and I can see that each of them has this ID. So ID 1, ID 2, and then ID 3. Now, if I check in the cart item, am I passing in the ID? I have the image, I have the title, price and amount, and then of course my remove. So I'm not passing in the ID. So how would I be able to pass my ID to my reducer? So that way, of course, in the reducer, I would know which item I'm removing. Because regardless of what functionality you pick, you will need that specific ID to remove that item. And the way it works in Redux, we have something called payload. So let me switch back to a card item, and then let me scroll down and maybe close the sidebar as well. And let's take a look at the dispatch. So we have our dispatch, and we know that we must have a type when we're dispatching an action, correct? But we also can add more values here. Now, if the type is necessary, so you cannot dispatch an action without a type, you can add whatever values you would like over here. However, in general, the common practice is calling this payload. Now, first of all, let me just show you how we would pass it and how we would check that in reducer, some kind of random value, and then we'll use a actual payload. So in my case, I'm just going to add a comma since it is an object, and then my key will be just some kind of ID. Now I'm gonna go with ID of 1, and let's just double check in our reducer whether we have access to it. So I will head to my reducer, then I have the action. So what was the key? What was the name of my key? The actual key was ID, correct? So let's see whether we have access to it if we check for remove. So I'm gonna go with console log, and then instead of this you remove amount, which doesn't make sense at all, so I guess I apologize for that, I'm gonna try to access action and then ID. So let's go with action dot ID. That is, of course, our key name. And then if we click, check it out. Now in the console, I'm getting this hard-coded value. Now for all of them, of course, it is 1 because I hard-coded 1, but that is already a success. So I know I can access this ID property. But like I said, a common practice is using a payload key and then set this up as an object. And how that looks like in the card item, instead of this ID, I would go with payload, then set it equal to an object, and then in fact, we pass in whatever values you would want. Again, I will name mine ID, but you can name it whatever you would want. Now, another question you're probably having is this one. Okay, so how we can pass this individual value, the one that we have specific for the actual item. Remember, each and every item had the ID, and all of them had unique IDs, not just one. So how we can get it? You see, when we used map dispatch to props, we have a second parameter, and second parameter is own props. So whatever props are being passed in the component. And if I would want to access it, I just type comma and then own props. As always, remember it is a parameter, so you can call this bacon. Doesn't really matter. You'll still have access to all the props that are being passed in a component. And in order to show how it looks like, I'm going to go with console log, and then let's take a look at our second parameter. So once we console log it, first of all, well, I have to complain because I passed in the ID and I didn't set any kind of value. So for the time being, again, let's set it to 1 so we don't have this nasty error. But then if I'm checking here, you can see that for each and every card item, I have the unique values here. So I have the ID, title, price, amount, and for all of them, of course, it just matches whatever I have in the card items. Now, just to showcase where are we getting this, of course, in the cart container, when we're mapping over our cart array, I have the cart item. I set this equal to an item ID, and then I use the spread operator again to get all the properties that are in the item. That's why we're pretty much passing everything. So now in the cart item, once I have access to my own props, what I can do? Well, I can just destructure out the ID and pass it in my payload, correct? So let's do const. Then I'm going to be looking for the ID. ID, of course, will be a key in this object. So let's write own props, and then let's set ID equal to ID. So again, we can do it the long way, ID equals to ID, or with ES6, as the key name is equal to a value name that we're passing, I can just have a shortcut, and now I'm passing in my ID. So now if I pop over to my reducer and change from action ID to action payload ID, because of course there is no more ID property on the action object because we renamed it to payload and then place the ID in the payload. Now in reducer, I can just say action, payload, and then dot ID. Let's save that. And now if I click on remove, notice this is number 1, number 2, and number 3. And now that we have all this set up, of course, now we just need to come up with a functionality. So if the action type is equal to remove, what we would want to do? Well, we'll start by, again, returning a new object, dot, 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 then copy the values from the old state, and then comma, and of course, we will set up some kind of new value for our card. Now, I do need to add a return here, otherwise I will have an error, and I'm going to set equal card. And now, since filter method on the array returns a new array, I can just say cart is equal, and then state cart. So I'm looking for the old cart in the state, or the old state cart, call it however you'd want, and then use the filter method on it. So you know that for the filter, we will iterate over our array, and then we will call the callback function against each and every item in our array. And I simply would want to check if the item ID matches to whatever I passed here as a payload, then of course that item will be removed. So I'm going to say if the individual item ID matches, then it will not be returned in my new array. So we have the callback function, and then in the callback function, the parameter represents that particular item in the array. And since it is a parameter, we can call it whatever we would want. Let me just set up my callback function first. And then let's write here cart item. That will be name of my parameter. And I only would want to return the item if the item ID does not match the payload ID that I'm passing from the cart item. And since it's going to be a one-liner, I might as well can actually skip the curly braces. And I'm just going to say cart item ID does not match actual ID that I'm passing. And remember, the property was action and then payload, since we set up our own object, and then we have the ID. So now, of course, let's save that, and we'll see that the moment I click on it, notice I'm removing the item, then the second one, then the third one. Of course, we can repeat this as many times as we would want. This time maybe from the back. So last one, and then last one is removed. So that's how we can set up remove functionality in our application. Awesome. We can remove items from our cart. So now let's start working on the increase and decrease. And again, we're going to do a bit of a setup first, and then one by one, we'll take a look at the functionalities because they're a bit more complicated than just remove or clearing the cart. So I'm going to start by setting up the cart item, where instead of just having a remove prop, of course, I also would want to have props for increase and decrease. So let me start a new line. And then in this case, maybe let me make this one smaller. It's going to be easier for me to copy and paste. And now let's copy and paste and maybe right away add some commas here. And as far as the names, we're going to go with increase, and then decrease. So what things we need to change here? Well, of course, we're not going to dispatch remove. For the increase, we would want to dispatch increase. We'll still pass the payload because we will look for that specific item. So that will stay the same. But as far as the decrease, I also would want to check the amount prop that is in the own props. So why we're checking the amount? Because if we're taking a look at the finished application, you can see that I can increase, of course, for all of them. But then as far as decreasing, if the amount for that specific item is more than one, well, then we just decrease the item here and here. But if the amount is less than one, then we just remove it from the cart. That's why not only we will pass the ID like we have for the remove and increase, we also will destructure it from the own props, the amount. And again, remember, it is in the actual cart items. So you can clearly see that particular property there. And then in the payload, not only will pass the ID like we have done already for the remove and increase, but we'll also do the same thing with the amount. So those are the two things we will need in the decrease. So extra will be that amount. And then since I have both of these props right now, I can scroll up, and not only I'm looking for the remove, I'm also looking for increase and decrease. And I can already see that I'm not using my variable. So of course there will be a mistake. So now let me change the decrease action type to a decrease. My apologies. Now let's continue. We have increase, and then of course we have decrease prop. And the setup will be exactly the same like we have for the remove. Let me just find those buttons. I can see that I have increase amount and then a decreased amount. So same spiel, we go with on click is equal to our arrow function, since we would want to run it when we click on a button. So in this case, since it is increase, I'm going to invoke my increase prop. And then I'm also going to do the same thing with my decrease button. But in order to speed things up, I'm just going to copy what we wrote and copy and paste it here where I have the decrease button. And of course, the only thing we need to change right now is the prop or the function that we will invoke. So instead of increase, we will go with decrease. Now, again, let me click we should see you increase the amount. Awesome, that works. And then also we should have a you decreased amount. So we correctly connected our cart item component to our dispatch. So now, of course, we just need to take care of the functionality in the reducer. Okay, and I think we will start with increase functionality because decrease is a bit more complicated since we would want to remove the item if the amount is less than 1. But functionality is very similar to increase. So I think once we're done with increase, it's going to be much more easier to work with a decrease. Same old spiel. Instead of console log, we're returning a new object. So let's go with the return, and then dot, dot, dot. Now we're copying, of course, our state. And then we could technically set up all our functionality similar way how we have with remove. So I could just say cart and then set up the functionality. However, there's more lines of code, and I think it might get confusing. That's the reason why I'm going to set up a separate variable and just assign it to my new cart value. So for the time being, I'm just going to say let temp cart is equal to an empty array. And then I'm going to say cart is equal to temp cart. So let me repeat. We could technically set up all the functionality that we're going to do in a second, set it equal to temp cart right away where we have the cart, and then overwrite the old cart value in our state. But of course, the reason why I'm setting this up as a separate variable, because there's going to be multiple lines of code right here. And I think it just makes it easier that we're setting up our new cart value, and then we're overriding that in our state. Now, it's of course not going to be an empty array. We will use a map method. So the way it works, we're going to go with state, then the value is cart, then we use the map method, and map method works very similar to a filter where we have a callback function, and that callback function is called against each and every item in our array. It returns a new array as a result. Now with the map though, we can change the values that we're returning. So filter was checking whether the condition matched, and based on that, it was either returning or not returning the item. Or in this case, we will return all of them. So all of the items will be placed in our new array. However, of course, we'll mutate it a bit where we will change the amount. So that will be our update. Like I said, we have our callback function, and then as a parameter, we can access each and every item. Now, what I would want to return from my cart item. So I'm iterating over my cart items, and then each and every item is represented by this cart item parameter. And then I need to decide what is going to be placed in my array. And for the time being, I'm just going to return the item the way it is. So I'm going to go with cart item, and it is returned. So at the moment, as I'm clicking, nothing's happening. I mean, I don't have any errors, but I'm also not updating my amount. So let's maybe start by console logging just so we can see what is the cart item. Maybe that way you'll have a more clearer understanding of what we're accessing. So if I console log, and then if I'm going to click on it, notice this will give me all 3 items. So I'm going to have Samsung, I'm going to have my pixels, and what this represents is my array. So I'm iterating over array. That's why I can see all 3 items. Now, what I would want to check. Of course, I would want to check whether the ID that I'm passing from the cart item, remember when we have an increase, we also passed a payload with an ID. So if the ID matches, then what I would want to do? Well, then I would want to update that amount. I see that I have Samsung Galaxy, correct? So that is the item that I just clicked on. So I would want to check if the ID matches, then the amount should be increased by 1. So here's going to be my setup. If the ID matches, then we will update amount. If not, regardless, we will still return our cart item. So we will return rest of them, the ones that do not have matching amount, because I still want them in my cart, but the one that matches should be increased by 1. Now let me get rid of the console log. As always, you can always keep it, but in my case, I will get rid of it. And now I'm going to say if cart item ID matches to whatever I'm passing in my payload. So remember action, payload ID. If that is the case, then set up a cart item and set it up equal to a new value. So now my cart item will be equal to a new value. If it doesn't match, we will return whatever we already have here. That's it. We don't really care about it. If it matches, then we will create a new one, essentially updated version. So in my case, I'm going to go with dot dot dot. Let me copy all the properties from the cart item. And as a side note, I just said that we will mutate. So that was my mistake. We will not mutate. We'll copy everything using the spread operator, and then we'll decide which property we would want to change. And of course, the one that I would want to change is the amount, correct? Because as we increase, we would want to change this amount value. So I'm going to say copy everything that you're getting from the cart item because the ID matched, and this should be the one that has the increased amount. So instead of mutating, like I by mistake said a minute ago, we will override that. We will have a cart item. All the values have been copied. And then for the amount, we'll have a new one. So I'm going to go with cart item amount. So whatever the amount was in the cart item, and add 1. So let's save that. And now as I'm clicking on increase, check it out. Now the Samsung one has 2 items in the cart. Then the same thing I can do for Pixel. Same thing I can do for my third one. So now we successfully added functionality where we can increase the amount of items in our cart. Great. We can increase the amount of items in a cart. So now let's start working with a decrease. Let's bite the bullet and get it done. Now the functionality will be almost exactly the same. However, we do need to check whether the amount is equal to 1. So if the amount is equal to 1, then we will remove the item from the cart. But initial setup will be exactly the same. Again, we are returning a new state. So dot dot dot. Let's copy the old state values. For the time being, we'll have a cart equal to our temporary variable. So I'm gonna go with, I don't know, let, and then temp cart again. And as far as the value, for the time being, I'm gonna set this equal to an empty array, just because we're gonna be checking, and if this is gonna be undefined, we'll have an error. So let me just override this as a temp cart. And then, like I said, we have 2 options. Either the amount is equal to bigger than 1, or it is in fact equal to 1. And then of course we would want to remove that item. So I'm gonna go with if action payload amount is equal to 1, then do one thing. But then if the actual amount is not equal to 1, which is gonna be the case, of course, if the amount is bigger than 1, then do something else. And we will start with that something else because it's going to be a bit more easier because the actual functionality is exactly the same like we already have here. The only difference is that instead of increasing the amount, we will decrease. So if the amount is equal to 1, let's just console log, hey, it's 1. And of course, I cannot do this. I need to have my template literals. So let's write, hey, it's 1. And then if it's not the case, then we're just going to decrease the amount. So like I said, we have our temp cart. Okay, at the moment, it is equal to an empty array. But we have already functionality for the increasing. And for the decreasing, it's exactly the same. Now let me copy and paste. And the only thing we'll change is, of course, we're not going to declare a new variable. Our variable will stay the same. So I'm going to go with temp cart. And what I'm saying right now is, yes, at the moment, it will be an empty array at the very beginning. But then if the amount is bigger than 1, then of course we are going to assign it to a new array. Again, we're mapping over the items. We're checking the ID. If the ID matches, then we just subtract 1 instead of add 1. That's all. That's the only change we would need to add. So let me save it. And then, of course, I'm going to be increasing. Okay, fine, awesome. And since it is bigger than 1, each and every time I'm going to click, I will decrease that amount. So that is good. But of course, by the time I'm going to get to 1, there should be a console log. So now it is equal to 1. I click on it. And now I just deleted the whole cart. Why I deleted the whole cart? Because temp cart is equal to an empty array. Correct? So we had an if statement. The value was equal to 1. So we just console logged, hey, it's 1. And then instead of going for an else, where we actually set our temp cart equal to an array with a decreased item, we just left it as an empty array, and that's why our cart right now is empty, but we have our console log, hey, it's 1. So we successfully set up the functionality where we can decrease if the amount is bigger than 1. Now let's fix up our code in our if statement. So instead of simple console log, we will do a filter functionality again, just like we had for remove. So the same thing. Again, we just need to check if the amount is equal to 1, then remove that item altogether. And again, this would be a case where it's much more simpler just to copy and paste. Now, I'm not a big fan of copying and pasting, but at the same time, rewriting the same syntax just doesn't make sense. So let me copy everything from the state, like so. Let's scroll up where we have the amount, copy and paste. And then in this case, we are just going to set our temp cart equal to state cart. We filter out. And then again, we're calling our callback function. We have our cart item ID. So each and every item has the ID. And if the item does not match, and as I can see here, I made some kind of bug because it should be action payload ID. Let me save it here. And also probably I should save it here in the bottom as well, because something must have happened as I was working with my reducer. So again, we just need to go back to action payload ID. That's the property that we're looking for. And now in this case, I can just check. Okay, I can increase all of them, of course. And then the moment I'm going to go below 1, you'll see how I remove the item. Again, we just decrease the amount. And then once we go below 1, then we just remove the item from the cart. Okay, with all our functionality in place, let's also set up a action that will count the items in the cart as well as the total amount of money. And if we check out the actions, in the beginning I have 2. I had get total and get amount, but in fact I changed my mind and we're just going to go with 1. So I'm sorry, but we're going to have to rewrite this a little bit where the action and the variable will be get totals, like so. So for both the amount and the money, the actual dollar amount. And as far as get amount, we will rewrite that because there's going to be another action, and the action name will be toggle amount. And you'll see why we're doing that. Essentially, it is because we will refactor our reducer a bit, since there's quite a bit of repetition in the decrease one. Remember, we had a decrease action, and in here, essentially, we're copying, pasting a lot of stuff. So I would want to refactor that. But first, we will start with our get totals. Now, we need to set up a cart container where we import our get totals action. And you'll see in a second why. So we're going to go with get totals. And now let's think about it. So when we would want to dispatch get totals, and I think an awesome time would be each and every time something will be updated in our cart container. Because every time we'll update something in our cart, for example, remove the item or increase the amount, we could just recalculate our totals. And what's really cool that in React, we have our hooks. And the hook that I would want to use is the use effect. Now, of course, we can import that use effect hook directly, or I can just type it react.useEffect. And since I find it faster to skip importing, I'm going to write React use effect. Now, as far as the use effect hook, we need to pass in the callback function that will run each and every time the component will re-render. Now, we could set up here an array. That would be a dependency array. But since we're just calculating the totals, there's really no need for it. And in my callback function, I would want to dispatch get totals. So I still have the access, of course, because remember we had map state to props, and I have my dispatch prop. So I can just pass it here a dispatch. And then remember, again, we needed to pass in our object. Then type will be get totals. Let's save that. And then in the reducer, first, let's set up some kind of console log just so we can see that for sure our functionality works. And then somewhere in the bottom, I guess right after the remove, I'm going to set up my if and then action type and set it equal to get totals. Now let's check it out if our console log works. So I'm going to say totals. And once we save it, each and every time we would want to do something with our items, well, we should see the console logs. Now, again, why is that happening? Because we have the cart container, and then each and every time something changes in the props, then of course we re-render. So since we run use effect after each re-render, that's why each and every time we will dispatch our GetTotals, and essentially we will calculate our totals. As far as the functionality, of course, it's going to be a bit more complicated than console logging the totals. And we will start by setting up a reduce function. So I'm going to go with two variables. So I'm going to do the structuring like this, and you'll see in a second why we're doing that. So I will create two variables from the object that I'm going to receive. And maybe more precisely is I will destructure the variables out of the object that will be returned from my reduce function. So now I'm going to use state cart. Again, that is my array. Then we're using the reduce function. And then in the reduce function, again, we pass in the callback function. Now, what's different about the reduce is the fact that we can return anything what we would want from reduce. And in our case, we will return an object with two properties, with total, and then for initial value, we'll set it equal to 0, and then amount, which also will be 0. So that's why I'm right away destructuring these two things out of there. And then once I save, I get a big fat error because the method name is not a reducer, it is a reduce. And I also would want to set up my parameters in the callback function. So similarly, how we have with filter and map, this callback function will run against each and every item in the array. Now, the difference is that we have two parameters right now. We're going to have our total. And since these are parameters, of course, we can call it whatever we would want. So I'm going to go with cart total. And then we will have a current item. And I'll represent that one with cart item. So two parameters. And then always when we work with reduce, we must return our total. So that's the way how the functionality works. So let me set this up. So return cart. And we're going to go with total. Let's save it. And since we don't have the error, now we can start actually working on a functionality. And the way it works, each and every item will be represented with this cart item. And what I would want to do? Well, first, I would want to set up my amount. How can I count that? Well, since each and every item is the object with all the properties and all that, I'm going to start by destructuring. And as always, if you would want to check it out, what you will have as far as the cart item, well, just console log it. That's going to be the best way. And once you do, you'll notice again, you'll have access to each and every item. So what I'm looking for is this amount. So how many items are in the cart? And I also would want to get the price because that will help me to calculate my total. But I'm going to go with the structuring in this case. So I'm going to look for price and then the amount, and that is coming from my cart item. So once I have these two things, I would want to calculate my amounts. And the way I can do that, since I know that I'm returning the object, now the cart total also, of course, represents that object. And for the amount, I can simply say this way. I can say cart total, my object, then look for the property of amount, and then each and every iteration, just add whatever amount you're getting from that particular item. So if there are 6 items in a cart, for example, then they will be added to my cart total, and then at the end, a return here. Now I also would need to return my new state. So return ... state, not GetTotals, sorry. So state, I'm copying all the properties from the state. And then the two that I would want to change will be total as well as the amount. Now let's see, we'll run it and notice how I'm getting 3 items. So why am I getting the 3 items? Because again, we use the reduce method. I loop over my array, my cart array, and then I just count how many items I have. And then I return in my object the amount property with initial value of 0. But then, of course, since I destructure out my amount and then override it in the state, in the old state, and return it as a new state, that's why I'm getting these values of 3. So if I'm going to keep on increasing, notice how my amount will also change. And similarly, we can work with the total. The only difference will be that we need to multiply price with the amount. Because think about it. So we have the total. For the total, not only I need to know how many items are in a cart, but what would be the individual cost for each and every item, right? So then, for example, I would multiply 5 by 500 or 1 by 700. So in this case, I'm going to set up a separate variable for that. So I'm going to go with const item total. So calculate each and every total for the item. And that one is simple. We just go with price then we multiply this by amount, like so. And then the same how we work with a mount property in the cart total, we'll do with a total. So let me move maybe amount down, and we're gonna go with cart total. Then the property I'm looking for is total, and it is equal to my item total. Now I'm sorry, we need to add it in each iteration. And then of course, now we have the correct total as well. Now, one thing with the total though, because we're gonna be adding decimals, we might run into following problem. So before we set up our state, I also would want to change my value a bit. And since I created total with let, of course I can override it here in the bottom, and I'm gonna use toFixed first. So we're gonna go with total toFixed. That's just gonna make sure that we only have 2 decimals. And then since it's gonna return a string, I'm gonna go with parse and then float, and then we're just gonna wrap our total. So that way we're not gonna have these crazy numbers, and at the max we'll have just 2 decimals after the dot. Okay, once our app is working, I would also like to cover some other Redux concepts, more specifically reducer default state and action creators. But before we do that, I would like to refactor our reducer a bit. Because while I think it's okay to copy and paste some code around while we're getting our feet wet with Redux, it's not very practical in a long run. Now, the following 2 videos are optional. So if you're happy with the code, feel free to kick back and relax, since the functionality of our app will not change. And I think the biggest offender is the decrease action, because essentially I copied my remove functionality, and also it is very similar to my increase. And we'll start by removing the remove functionality. So instead of checking that in reducer, whether the amount is 1, I can do it also in the cart item. So notice we have our button, correct? We have our decrease amount button. And in this case, I'm returning my decrease function, correct? I have my decrease prop, that is the function, and I'm just returning once I click on decrease. And I think a better option would be actually checking what is the amount. So if the amount is 1, then we will return remove functionality. So we'll just remove the actual item. Or if the amount is bigger than 1, then of course we will still return decrease function. And what that allows us to do is in the reducer, I don't need to check for the amount. So that way I don't need to copy and paste my remove functionality. And then deletions that I would want to make, my first if statement, and also since I don't have the if statement, of course, I also don't need else. So let me delete line 13. In my case, of course, maybe in your case, the numbers are different, but just delete the else. We'll delete also the closing curly brace. And since I wouldn't want my if statement, and instead of setting it equal to an empty array, well, let's just keep on deleting. And then right away, we'll set our temp cart equal to a state cart, like so. Let's save it. And now, of course, we don't have the functionality of removing the item. So you'll notice as I'm decreasing, I'm going to go negative. Now, of course, the way we would fix that is in the cart item. Like I said, we will check. So if the item amount will be equal to 1, then of course we will return and run effectively remove function. Of course, if it's not equal to 1, then we will just decrease. Now in this case, I do need to set up my curly braces. That will be my start. And then of course, I'm not just returning decrease. I need to set up the if statement. So I'm going to go with if. Now I still have the access to amount. Remember, it is still our prop, and I can just check here. If amount is equal to 1, then like I said, we will return a remove function. So let's go with remove and invoke the function. However, if the amount is not equal to 1, which would be all the other cases, then of course I will return the decrease. So let me move it in the else. Let's save that. And now once we refresh the application, you'll notice that I can still increase, of course, I can still decrease, but the moment my amount will be equal to 1, I'm just going to remove the item. So like I said, still the same functionality. However, currently in the reducer, I'm not repeating myself by copying and pasting the functionality from the remove action. Beautiful. With our initial refactor out of the way, next I would like to focus on the fact that decrease and increase essentially have exactly the same functionality, The only difference is the -1. And then in here, of course, I have +1. That's why I will create a separate action, just so you still can have references for these two. But then in that action, we'll take care of the both, the decrease and increase. Now, the way it will work in the actions, currently we have toggle amount. So first, we would need to import in the cart item. So let me navigate there. Instead of just remove, decrease, and increase, we will also go with toggle amount. Okay, awesome. Then remember down in the bottom, we had our match dispatch the props. And of course, we would still want to dispatch our action. Or in this case, it's going to be a bit more complicated as far as our function. Now, it's not going to be much more complicated, but just a bit. So we're going to go with toggle. So that's how I'm going to name my function. And then in this case, I'm going to pass in the function a argument. So when we will actually invoke our function, we'll also pass in the actual argument. And that argument will be either we will increase or decrease. Since again, it's going to be the same function, but in the function, we'll check whether we're increasing or decreasing. So that way we won't have to copy and paste the same functionality. So again, toggle function, but then unlike the other ones, in this one, we will pass here a parameter, which eventually will be our argument. And then we'll still return a dispatch. So let me set this up. We will go with dispatch, then type will be toggle amount. Remember, we needed to have an object, then toggle amount. And then for the payload, I'll pass two things. I'll pass the ID because I still need to know which item it is. And the second one will be my toggle. So the one that I'm passing in the actual function, I'll pass it also in my payload. So payload is an object. We have the ID that is coming from the own props, of course. And then the second one, like I said, is the toggle parameter that we will pass in actually our return. So we have our return, and then instead of increase and decrease, now we will use our toggle. See, the function that we created last, that's the one we will import first. So let me check where I have the cart item. So I have increase, decrease. Now those will stay for your reference, but I will also get as a prop my toggle. And then, like I said, instead of increase, I will go with toggle. And then as far as the toggle argument, it will be either inc, so INC, or DEC. So either I'm increasing or decreasing. So in my case, since it is a increase button, that's why I'll pass my toggle as a string inc. So that means I'm increasing. And the same thing I would want to do here where I have the decrease. So I'm not going to return a decrease. I will return a toggle. However, in this case, of course, my argument will change to DEC. Now I'll say both of them. And of course, now in a reducer, I need to take care of that. So let me first look for my reducer. Then, of course, I need to import. So I'm going to go with toggle amount. Okay, we imported our action. And then again, let's find a place somewhere here, maybe in the bottom. I think that will make more sense. I'm going to go with if action type is equal. And again, we're looking for the toggle amount. And in this case, we will copy and paste some code. Or remember that we will set up a one function that takes care of the both. Now we'll still do the map. I mean, that will not change. However, we're just going to place both of them in the same place. So let's start this way. We have our toggle amount. Okay, awesome. Then let's set up our curly braces. And you know what? Just to make things interesting and just to show you how it would look like if we would just write everything in one object, we'll make things interesting where I will right away return my state. So I'll copy and paste my values. That's fine. Or maybe more precisely, I'll copy all my values. And then I'm right away going to overwrite cart. And in this case, instead of setting up a separate variable, let's write state cart. So we run our map function. That still stays the same. Then remember we had a callback function. So I'm going to go with cart item. And now what are we returning from the cart item? So this is going to be the case where if the actual ID doesn't match, then I would just return a cart item. That still stays the same. That would be my default. However, then I'll have two sets of if statements. So first I'm going to have if statement if the ID matches. Then of course I would want to make some changes, just like we did previously here. Remember again, we checked for the ID. If the ID matched the payload ID, then of course we returned a new item. But if it didn't, then we just returned whatever item was in the array. Now, in this case, there's going to be two sets of if statements. So again, we have our return card item. So we have default taken care of, but now I would want to set up my if, then cart item ID. If that matches to my action payload ID, then I would want to have another set of if statements. And in this case, it's going to be following, where I'm going to go with action payload, and then remember the toggle argument that we passed. And I'm going to say if it is equal to increment, so INC, then of course I would want to return, and I'm going to return my cart item. So I'm going to go with cart item. So essentially I'm overriding whatever I have here, and I'm going to set it equal to my new object. So everything exactly the same, but in this case, we're using the if statement. So the same line of code effectively here. So I will write here cart item dot dot dot. Let's copy everything that we have in the cart item at the moment. And then since the argument is increase, that's why amount will be equal. You guessed it, cart item amount, and then +1, correct? I'm sorry, not +2, +1. And of course, I would also need to set up another if statement if the toggle argument is equal to decrease. So in this case, we can copy and paste. It's not a crime. And I'm going to go with decrease and then -1. So again, in this case, we're not copying pasting the whole functionality. We just check within the map whether we are increasing or decreasing. So again, notice we can increase, we can decrease. And since we set up the functionality to remove the item, now, of course, we can just remove the item. Early on in the project, I showed you how we can set up an initial store by passing it as a second argument in our create store. However, in Redux, there's alternative way how we can pass in the store or initial state into our reducer. And the concept is following, where as your application grows bigger, you would want to start combining your reducers. So essentially, you don't want to set up all the functionality in one reducer. So that's why you'll start setting up separate reducers. And in that case, you would want to pass in the state directly in the reducer. But at the moment, we already know that if I remove my initial store, of course, I will have an error because my reducer will get undefined. Because at the moment, notice I have my state. I'm relying on my old state. But since initially state is undefined, then all the functionality goes bananas. Now I can tell you right away that we will not implement the whole setup for combined reducers, where we set up separate reducers and then combine them together, because I think our application is not big enough. So it doesn't really make sense. But since I would want you to be aware of the other setup as well, I'll show you how I can pass initial store directly in the reducer. So we removed it from create store. We got an error. Okay, we already expected that. Now, how does it work? Well, reducer is a function, correct? And in function, we have something called default parameters that came along with ES6. And the way we write default parameters is in a following fashion, where if I have my parameter, and for example, if my parameter is undefined, I'll set it to some kind of default value. And you already saw that in the cart container, where I had the cart prop that was coming, of course, from my map state to props, but I also set it equal to an empty array. So for example, if for some weird reason my cart is not an array, then at least I'll have the empty array as a default value. Because if we have the if statement that is depending on that, since I'm checking for the cart prop length and I'm setting if it is equal to 0, then display this, and then if it's not, then display something, at least I will have something. So it's not going to be an error. And we'll do exactly the same in the reducer. So I have my state, and I know that initially it will be undefined. But of course, in this case, I could set it equal to whatever I have in my initial store. Now, one thing that I would need to do is, of course, cut it out from the app.js. Let me grab it, then copy and paste in the reducer, like so. Now I'll change these values around. Of course, I don't need to hard code them anymore. So I will go with 0 and 0. And also remember that we have the cart items. So we would need to import our cart items. So for the time being, let me save it. Of course, we'll still have an error because I haven't assigned my state to something. But let me head back to app.js. And of course, I can just copy and paste, or you know what, cut it out. I don't need it. So let me cut it out. And then in the reducer, I don't know, right after the actions, I guess, I will import my cart items. And now I'll set my store, if it is undefined, which it will be undefined in the beginning, equal to my initial store. And now you'll see that the moment we save it, everything again works. And again, it comes in very handy once you start combining reducers. Once you start splitting up the code from one reducer into multiple reducers, and you're able to pass in the actual state directly in that reducer. So for example, you could have some kind of modal reducer where it will have only one property, is the modal open, and then you'll toggle that. Because there's really no point for you to keep on adding everything within that one state object and then keep on setting up the functionality, because eventually it will get hard to manage. Again, we will not cover this in this project, but I wanted you to be aware of the fact that not only we can pass in our initial store when we set up our create store, but also we can do that directly in the reducer if we use ES6 default parameters. So if the parameter is undefined, then I just set it equal to my initial store and all my functionality will still work. And one more interesting Redux concept that I would want to show you is how we can create action creators. Now, it sounds way more complicated than it really is. And the general idea behind action creators is following. Where notice when we're setting up our functions, correct? We have this dispatch, and then of course, we do need to have our actions object, and then we need to pass in a type. And it is fine in our small application because, of course, we're just dispatching, for example, the remove action one time. But then you can imagine as your application grows and you need to rewrite this multiple times, in some way you're asking for the trouble because you might introduce the bug. And the way action creators work is we set up the function that always returns our particular type. And then optionally, if we would want to pass some kind of parameters in a function, of course we can do that. Now I will not refactor all my actions. Again, that would be an overkill. However, we will rewrite our remove action using the action creator just so you can see the benefit of that. And like I said, it would be a function. So instead of passing in manually our actions object with the type, we're just going to set up a function that does that for us. I'm going to go with export. Again, we would need to export it since we'll use it instead of a plain old action. And then as always, call it whatever you'd want. I'm going to go with remove item. And then, like I said, it will be a function. Let me set this up as a empty function. And then, like I already previously mentioned, the whole point of this action creator is to always return a proper action with a proper type. So in our case, since I'm setting up action creator for remove, of course, I will return the action object with a type of remove. So I'm going to go with return. Then I'm returning my object type. Yes, you guessed it, will be remove. And then remember, for remove, we still needed the payload. So that doesn't change. I still need to pass here the payload. And in my case, I'm going to set this up as an object. And then I'm passing in the ID. And now probably the question is, well, where are we going to get this ID? Well, we're setting this up as a function, correct? So I'm just going to say, all right, so just pass here as an argument my ID. Now I will save my actions. And then, of course, we will navigate to cart item because that's where we're using the remove item. Now we do need to import it. So I have increase, decrease, and all that. So now I'm just going to be importing my remove item. Okay, awesome. And then let's scroll down to the bottom and then replace our simple remove where we manually wrote our type, remove, and all that payload and pass in a dispatch our function. Again, it sounds way more complicated than it really is. What you're doing is you're taking out the manual labor of setting up your action objects by hand just by passing here remove item. Now we're still getting our ID from our own props. So I can pass in my ID right here. And as you will see, the functionality will not change. But just imagine the scenario where you would have an application where you would need to dispatch your remove action 20 times. So which option would be easier and potentially have less bugs? You have a function where you just need to pass the ID, and you always will have your type correct equal to remove. And yes, you would set them up in the same file. Might as well. You have your actions, so you right away can pass it. Or the other option would be manually again, type increase, then payload, and all that. And I think we have a pretty clear winner because I think it is much more easier to get our function and then optionally pass some kind of argument if you would have to. If you don't have to, then you would always just return the correct action type. So that's how we can set up our action creators. Now let me double check, because that would be hilarious if I'm trying to show you a better way how you can set up your application to avoid bugs, but then I would introduce bugs in my own application. 1, 2, 3, and there you go. That's how we can set up the action creators in our Redux application. Just like React, Redux also has DevTools. And one could even argue that in Redux, using DevTools is much more beneficial than traditional React. However, the setup is a bit more complicated because not only you need to get the extension, just like normal React, you would also need to set up a bit of the code. So we'll do that in this video, and I'll show you the benefits of using Redux Dev Tools. So in order to get up and running with Redux Dev Tools, first of all, we need to search for them. I think that will be the fastest way because you'll right away get a link to extensions. That should be your first suggestion. Click on it and then get the extension. Bravely click on add to Chrome and you'll be good to go. However, you'll notice that even though we have installed the DevTools, well, we'll have a bit of an issue. I will go with inspect. Notice I do have the Redux, but then I can see that no store found. Make sure to follow the instructions. And the instructions are following, where essentially we would need to add piece of code. So again, let me go to blank Google, and we're going to type again Redux Dev Tools. And now in this case, let's look for the extension. So let's look for Redux Dev Tools extension. That's the one we would want. And then instead of following the first link, which essentially just gave us an extension, in this case, I would want to go to a GitHub repo. Let's bravely click on that. Then we are going to keep on scrolling. Of course, there's all the installation and everything explained. But what we're looking for is this piece of code. Now, I also would want to mention that there is an alternative way we can install the package that does that for us. And essentially, as you start setting up your middleware and all that, that probably is a better way. But in our case, again, we have a simple application. We're just getting our feet wet with Redux. So we're just going to go with a simple code. So that's what you would need to copy. You have your create store, then you have your reducer, and then comma, and then window, and then whatever this mumbo jumbo gibberish that is on the screen. So let me copy the code, then head back to my text editor, add a comma, copy and paste. Let's save it. And now if we're going to check it out on a bigger browser window, we should have access to our DevTools. And we do. And as you can see, it has a very, very nice interface. I can right away see what actions were dispatched. So notice how 2 times we dispatched GetTotals. And in fact, we will fix that later on in the video. But as far as the DevTools, notice we have the actions. So of course, these would be the actions that were dispatched. Then we also have our state. So for example, we have our cart, then total, then amount. And as something is going to be happening in the actual application, of course, notice again, we are shown all the actions that were dispatched. We are shown what is the current state of the state or the store. Then we also have this nice chart and all that. And again, there's many, many interesting things that you can find in the DevTools. And like I said, one could argue that they are way more beneficial than traditional React. And I'll start by checking why I have GetTotals twice. So why we're dispatching this action. And the reason for that is because in the cart container, remember we ran our use effect. Now the way use effect works, it runs after every render, unless you set up the dependency array. And this is exactly what's happening. That's why we run it twice. And in order to fix that, I would need to add my dependency array. So I'm going to add my array as a second argument. And then in my dependency array, I'm just going to say, you know what? call this callback function only if something changes in the cart. So I'm going to go with cart. Let's save it. And we'll see that we only run our GetTotals once. So only if something will change in the cart, then of course we'll calculate our totals. Let me test it out. Notice in this case, I toggled the amount. Okay, I can see that my amount went from 3 to 4. Then my total went from 1800 to 2400. And the last action that was dispatched was getting totals. Now we're also going to get a warning in our console. So let me open up my console and you'll see that React hook, the use effect, has a missing dependency, and the issue is the dispatch. So as a second item in our dependency array, you can just pass in a dispatch. Again, that's not going to fix the get totals, or at least the React won't complain about our setup. So that's how we can get up and running with Redux Dev Tools.